You probably imagine the Ming Dynasty as China's golden age. Elegant porcelain vases, magnificent palaces, and disciplined armies guarding the Great Wall. But here's the twist. Behind that glittering facade was a world so disturbing it makes today's political scandals look like playground drama. Imagine an empire where the emperor's word wasn't just law, it was life or death, where a single rumor could see you publicly beaten with heavy wooden staves until your bones shattered, where women were locked inside the forbidden city to serve one man, and eunuchs, yes, castrated servants, secretly ruled behind the scenes like shadow emperors. The Ming weren't just builders of beauty, they perfected cruelty, paranoia, and surveillance centuries before Big Brother. Think your boss micromanages? The Ming Emperor spied on his own spies. In this story, we'll peel back the layers of the so-called Golden Age and descend into its darker truths, each chapter like a trapdoor leading deeper underground. From bizarre sexual politics to grotesque tortures, from hypocritical morality laws to deadly purges, the Ming Dynasty's legacy is one of brilliance drenched in blood. By the end, you'll ask yourself, was this really a golden empire, or the world's first dystopian nightmare? And here's the real shock. The echoes of Ming paranoia, censorship, and spectacle are still haunting us today. They tell us the Ming Dynasty was China's golden age. The world remembers shimmering porcelain, silk flowing down trade routes, and palaces gleaming with perfect symmetry. Tourists today stand before the Forbidden City in Beijing and whisper in awe, imagining a land of beauty, order, and stability. But that vision, polished, serene, majestic, is a mask, and beneath it lurked something far darker. Imagine an empire obsessed with appearances. To the outside world, Ming China was a well-oiled machine of etiquette, Confucian values, and cosmic harmony. But in reality, its rulers lived in constant fear of enemies, fear of betrayal, fear of their own people. The Ming emperors did not just reign over one of the wealthiest civilizations on earth. They reigned from within a cage of paranoia, and the more glorious the mask, the more grotesque the face beneath. Take the Forbidden City itself, that sprawling architectural wonder with its blood-red walls and golden roofs. Visitors today see a palace. Ming subjects saw a prison for them and for their emperor. Behind those walls, the Son of Heaven rarely dared show his face. Some emperors hid for months, even years, refusing to appear in public. They ruled like ghosts, issuing decrees through eunuchs who whispered on their behalf. Outwardly divine, inwardly terrified. And the obsession with appearances wasn't just architectural, it was personal. Court rituals were rigid to the point of absurdity. The emperor was surrounded by ceremonies that made him untouchable, so untouchable that even officials who approached him risked punishment if they bowed at the wrong angle or spoke the wrong word. In theory, it was about reverence. In practice, it was a theater of humiliation, where one slip of protocol could cost you your life. This was the real Ming paradox. They celebrated beauty while weaponizing fear. The shimmering porcelain that dazzles museums today was often produced in workshops where artisans toiled under threat of brutal punishment for imperfections. A vase might survive 1,000 years, its maker rarely survived his mistakes. It's the same contradiction you see in modern fashion houses or tech giants. Publicly adored products, privately fueled by cruelty, obsession, and broken human lives. Even the famous Great Wall, expanded to its greatest extent under the Ming, was less a monument of confidence than a symptom of their terror. Its endless stones stand like scars across the northern frontier, a desperate attempt to wall out enemies. And like every wall in history, it told the world less about strength than about fear. The dynasty that claimed divine harmony was in reality obsessed with barricades, both physical and psychological. Behind the painted mask of glory, the dynasty was already cracking. The emperor's paranoia gave birth to entire networks of secret police, Men who monitored conversations, tracked dissent, and reported back with lethal consequences. Ordinary people lived in silence, knowing that too many words or the wrong ones could end their lives. Beauty became propaganda. Order became oppression. And yet, the mask worked. Foreign visitors to Ming China wrote of wonders beyond imagination, dazzled by the glittering surfaces and elaborate rituals. They didn't see the bruises of men beaten in public squares. They didn't hear the muffled sobs of palace concubines locked away for life. They didn't feel the chill of a society where every smile had to be rehearsed, every bow exact. Like a modern influencer curating perfection on Instagram, the Ming Dynasty curated a golden illusion, and the world bought it. But illusions cannot last forever. For behind the mask of porcelain and palaces, a new power was rising, one that would twist the empire's fear into something even more grotesque. Castrated men, mutilated to serve yet hungry to dominate, were about to take the stage, and once they did, the empire's mask would not only slip, it would shatter. It begins with a knife. Not in the heat of battle, but in the cold ritual of mutilation. Young boys, often sold by desperate parents, were led into shadowy rooms where their entire manhood was removed, sometimes with crude tools, sometimes with nothing more than a sharp blade and boiling water. Few survived the operation. Those who did awoke as something in between, neither fully man nor free. These were the eunuchs of the Ming Dynasty, men whose bodies were broken so they could serve and eventually rule. In a cruel irony, the dynasty obsessed with purity trusted only the mutilated. The logic was chilling. A eunuch could not father children, therefore he could not build a dynasty of his own. He was safe, loyal, disposable. At least that's what emperors told themselves. But history has a twisted sense of humor. The very men stripped of power at birth soon became the most dangerous power brokers in China. Inside the Forbidden City, eunuchs were everywhere. They guarded the gates, polished the porcelain, carried the emperor's slippers. But their true weapon wasn't service. It was proximity. They were the ones who whispered into the Son of Heaven's ear, controlled access to his chambers, and filtered every scrap of information that reached him. If the emperor was a god on earth, eunuchs were the priests who spoke on his behalf, and sometimes the priests became gods themselves. Consider Wei Zhongshan, perhaps the most infamous eunuch of all. By the early 17th century, he had clawed his way from mutilated servant to de facto ruler of the empire. Officials bowed to him as if he were the emperor himself. His enemies, beaten, exiled, executed. At one point, he even had temples built in his own honor, an unthinkable act of arrogance in Confucian China. Imagine a White House aide demanding statues of himself across the country, while the president sat silent. That was the grotesque inversion of power the Ming allowed. And Wei was no exception. Generations of emperors leaned on their eunuchs, some out of laziness, others out of fear. One emperor retreated so completely into his harem and hobbies that he left the affairs of state entirely to his eunuch advisors, spending his days breeding exotic birds and crafting toys, while eunuchs decided who lived and who died in the empire outside. The system created monsters of secrecy. Eunuchs built vast intelligence networks inside the palace, trading bribes for information, deciding which petitions the emperor saw and which were burned in silence. They could raise armies, command executions, even control the flow of silver and grain across the empire. And they did it all without lineage, without official mandate, without accountability. Castration, ironically, had freed them from the very chains that bound the nobility. The emotional cruelty was staggering. To the outside world, eunuchs were objects of ridicule, half men, unnatural creatures, whispered about with disgust. But within the palace walls, those same half men held the power of life and death over entire families. It was the perfect cocktail of humiliation and authority. Despised publicly, feared privately. They lived in a paradox that fueled their paranoia and their cruelty. And the violence they inflicted was not subtle. Eunuchs personally supervised torture chambers in the palace, where disobedient officials were beaten with bamboo rods until their bones cracked. Some were forced to confess crimes they never committed, simply because a eunuch decided their loyalty was suspect. Others were left to rot in secret prisons beneath the palace, forgotten by history except for the records of their suffering. To understand the sheer perversity of it, think of a modern reality show where the supposedly powerless servant suddenly controls the fate of every contestant while the supposed star hides in his dressing room. That was the Ming court, a stage where emperors played the role of divine rulers while eunuchs pulled the strings behind the curtain. And the more power they gained, the more grotesque the system became. By the dynasty's twilight years, tens of thousands of eunuchs staffed the palace, a city within a city. Their whispered intrigues determined war and peace, famine and feast. An empire that once boasted scholars, warriors, and emperors had by its end become the playground of mutilated courtiers who were never meant to rule at all. But mutilation was only one form of prison in the Ming. For if eunuchs controlled the empire through whispers and blood, another group lived behind even thicker walls, trapped in a nightmare disguised as luxury. They were women, thousands of them, locked away in the forbidden city, prized, pampered, and discarded. And their story makes the world of eunuchs look almost merciful. They called it the inner court. To outsiders, it sounded like a paradise, an endless palace filled with silken robes, jade jewelry, and the most beautiful women in the empire. But to the women who lived there, it was less a dream than a life sentence. The Forbidden City was not just a home for emperors, it was a prison for thousands of concubines, locked away for life in the name of serving one man. The myth is that these women lived in luxury, pampered and adored. The reality is darker. From the moment a girl entered the palace, often as young as 13 or 14, her fate was sealed. She was cut off from her family forever, trapped inside walls she would never escape. It didn't matter if she rose to the emperor's bed or spent her life unseen in some shadowy corridor. The door had closed behind her for good. Inside, the women became rivals in a deadly game. Every concubine competed for the emperor's fleeting attention, knowing that his favor could mean survival, while his indifference meant oblivion. Petty jealousies spiraled into lethal feuds. One concubine might accuse another of witchcraft, poisoning, or disobedience, and without trial the accused could be beaten to death or quietly strangled with a silk cord. The so-called harem was less romance than a cage of paranoia, like a season of reality TV in which the losers were literally eliminated. Even those who rose to power lived under constant threat. The emperor's favor was fickle. A woman who bore him a son might be showered with wealth one day, only to find herself discarded the next if another caught his eye. For the rest, thousands of women languished in gilded obscurity, never once touched by the emperor, never once spoken to, their lives wasted in waiting. Imagine being locked in a palace your entire life, only to die having never once spoken to the man you were forced to serve. And the cruelty didn't end with neglect. Suspicion haunted the emperor's court. Concubines accused of infidelity, often with no evidence at all, were subject to brutal punishment. Some were beaten publicly, their dignity stripped in front of the very eunuchs who controlled their fates. Others were quietly executed to maintain moral order. The Ming court believed that women existed solely to serve the emperor's body and bloodline, and yet treated them as disposable when they became inconvenient. The cruelty could turn grotesque. Historical records whisper of concubines entombed alive, sealed into rooms with no doors when they fell out of favor, their screams muffled by the walls of the Forbidden City. For the empire, it was efficiency. Why waste resources on a woman no longer useful? For the women, it was a nightmare ending in silence. And yet, to the outside world, the harem was painted as the height of imperial splendor. Foreign envoys heard tales of the emperor surrounded by thousands of the most beautiful women, a vision of divine abundance. What they never saw were the locked gates, the jealous feuds, the lonely deaths. It was the same trick as the porcelain and the palaces. Beauty masking brutality. To call it hypocrisy is almost too kind. The dynasty preached Confucian virtue, family loyalty, and harmony, while at the same time tearing daughters from their families and imprisoning them in a lifetime of jealousy, suspicion, and fear. These were not wives or companions. They were offerings, sacrifices to a throne that demanded obedience, even in intimacy. And here's the most bitter irony. While thousands of women wasted away in captivity, many emperors barely visited their harems at all. Some preferred toys, gardens, or hobbies to the women locked away for their pleasure. It was neglect turned into cruelty, luxury turned into despair. The emperor's absence didn't free the women. It made their prison all the more meaningless. But the palace's cruelty didn't stop at women's lives. For those who lived outside its walls, punishment took on an even bloodier, more spectacular form. Because while concubines were silenced in private, the wider empire was taught obedience in public, and the methods used to teach that lesson would chill the blood. It always began with a crowd, ordinary people, summoned to watch their neighbor, their official, their criminal, or sometimes their innocent scapegoat, paraded into the square. In Ming China, punishment wasn't just about justice. It was performance. Torture was not hidden away in dark basements. It was a spectacle, a show designed to terrify, and the audience, everyone. The myth of the Ming as refined guardians of porcelain and poetry shatters the moment you read their law codes. Petty theft could earn you a flogging so savage that your back turned to pulp. Officials accused of corruption were forced through elaborate rituals of humiliation before being beaten with wooden staves. Imagine a courtroom where sentencing isn't a quiet gavel strike, but a public countdown to how many bones will be broken. The punishments were grotesque in their creativity. Cudgeling was a favorite. Officials ordered to strike the accused with heavy rods across the back, legs, or even the face. Victims often died not from the beating itself, but from infection, shattered bones piercing their flesh. And this was considered one of the lighter punishments. Then there was the infamous death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned was strapped upright, their flesh slowly carved away piece by piece, while the crowd watched. The executioner sliced deliberately, an arm muscle here, a strip of chest there, turning the human body into a gruesome anatomy lesson performed in real time. It could last for hours, the victim conscious long enough to see parts of themselves fall to the ground. For the Ming, this was not just killing, it was theater. Public executions carried the same energy as modern stadium events. Crowds jostled for position, vendors sold food, and people brought children to watch as if it were a holiday. The condemned wasn't simply punished. They were turned into a warning, their agony magnified by the collective gaze of thousands. It was the empire's way of saying, step out of line, and this could be you. Imagine a society where torture was as common as sports, where a day at the gallows replaced a day at the cinema. Even the bureaucracy of punishment was terrifying. The Ming maintained a system of official torturers whose job was to extract confessions accused of a crime. You were tied down and subjected to the rack, where ropes twisted your limbs until joints snapped, or the knee crusher, a device that splintered bones into fragments while officials calmly recorded your confession. The logic was simple. Truth didn't matter, obedience did, and obedience was extracted through screams. What's most disturbing is how ordinary it all became. The empire functioned on a rhythm of pain. Officials feared not just dismissal but physical torment. Farmers and merchants feared not just prison but public mutilation. Even the innocent were not safe. Families of traitors could be tortured alongside the accused, their bodies broken to emphasize that loyalty was collective, not individual. It was justice by contagion, punishment as inheritance. The Ming justified it all with morality. Harsh punishment, they argued, kept order and harmony. But in practice, it created a culture of terror where even the most loyal servant or subject knew their body was never truly safe. Harmony was built on bruises. The empire's golden mask gleamed in museums, while its people carried the scars of wood, rope, and blade. And yet, behind the horror, there was something disturbingly familiar. A society where punishment was spectacle is not as distant from us as we'd like to think. Today, we may not gather in squares to watch men flayed alive, but we do watch public shaming unfold online. We still feed on humiliation, still treat suffering as entertainment. Only now the blood is digital. The Ming didn't invent cruelty. They simply perfected its stagecraft. But the empire's obsession with control went beyond blood in the streets. Public torture silenced dissent in villages and cities. Inside the palace, however, the emperor demanded something even more insidious: silence behind closed doors, secrets collected not through screams but whispers, because in the shadows of the Forbidden City, another force was rising: the emperor's secret police. Men whose job was not just to punish bodies, but to invade thoughts. And once they emerged, the terror of staves and knives would look almost merciful. Terror in the Ming Dynasty didn't only wear the mask of broken bones and public blood. Sometimes it wore no mask at all, just the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind you, or the sudden appearance of a stranger who already knew your secrets. Because while the empire perfected torture as theater, it also built something more chilling, a state of surveillance so ruthless, it makes Orwell's vision look like a children's bedtime story. They called it the Eastern Depot. On paper, it was an imperial guard unit, loyal to the throne. In reality, it was a secret police force with no limits, commanded not by scholars or generals, but by eunuchs, those same mutilated courtiers who already ruled the emperor's ear. If public executions terrified the masses, the depot terrified everyone else. They weren't soldiers of the battlefield. They were soldiers of silence. Imagine living in a world where every conversation, every private joke, every sigh of complaint could be overheard and reported. The depot thrived on informants, neighbors, co-workers, even family members. A careless word at dinner could echo all the way to the Forbidden City. And when it did, the results were never merciful. A midnight knock at your door, a disappearance into a black carriage, and you were swallowed by a prison that technically didn't exist. Inside those secret prisons, truth was irrelevant. Guilt was assumed. Interrogations blurred into torture, and confessions were scripted before the accused even spoke. The real goal wasn't finding traitors. It was reminding the empire that everyone could be one. Even high officials, men who thought themselves untouchable, found their careers and lives ended by anonymous whispers. Loyalty meant nothing when fear was the only true currency. The emperor's paranoia fed the system. Some rulers relied on the depot because they trusted no one else. Ministers could lie, generals could betray, but the eunuchs, broken, humiliated, stripped of family ties, were seen as loyal tools. That trust allowed them to spin webs of surveillance across the empire, binding peasants and princes alike. The empire became a theater of whispers, where even silence felt suspicious. And the cruelty extended beyond politics. Families were destroyed because one member was accused. Whole households disappeared into the depot's cells, their property confiscated, their names erased. Fear didn't just silence dissent, it rewrote the very structure of society. Everyone was guilty until proven otherwise, and no one was ever proven innocent. What makes it so disturbing is how modern it feels. Swap the eunuchs for digital networks, the informants for algorithms, the prisons for black sites, and the logic is the same. Surveillance doesn't need to be accurate to be effective. It just needs to be terrifying. The Ming understood this centuries before our age of data leaks and spyware. They didn't just watch people, they made people believe they were always being watched. The result was suffocating. Scholars, the supposed backbone of Confucian order, lived in constant anxiety. Every petition to the throne was a risk. Every student conversation in the academy could be twisted into rebellion. Creativity wilted, loyalty warped into performance, and truth itself drowned under the weight of fear. And yet, for all the terror the Eastern Depot unleashed, it was still dressed in ritual and righteousness. The dynasty claimed it was protecting harmony, purging corruption, ensuring loyalty to the Son of Heaven. But what it really created was a society where trust was impossible, where neighbors spied on neighbors, and where survival meant silence. But the silence of spies was only half the hypocrisy. Because while the depot crushed ordinary people for the slightest misstep, the elites behind palace walls indulged in extravagance that mocked the very values they forced upon others. Public morality was preached with iron fists, even as private decadence rotted the dynasty from within. And that hypocrisy was so obscene, so shameless, it makes the secret police look almost tame. The Ming Dynasty liked to call itself the guardian of virtue. Its emperors draped themselves in Confucian rhetoric, proclaiming order, discipline, and moral purity as the sacred pillars of society. Officials were lectured endlessly about filial piety, restraint, and loyalty. Ordinary citizens were beaten or even executed for violating codes of morality that claimed to protect harmony. But behind palace walls, those same ideals were mocked by the very men who enforced them. The empire of virtue was, in truth, an empire of hypocrisy. Consider the emperor himself, the supposed model of moral perfection. One ruler, obsessed with religious rituals, forced his court to bow in exhausting ceremonies that dragged on for hours. He presented himself as a pious guardian of order, yet when night fell, he indulged in drinking binges and lavish feasts that wasted enough food to feed starving families. It was morality as theater, excess as habit. And it wasn't just emperors. Eunuchs who supervised public punishments for immorality secretly ran underground brothels, bribing guards to smuggle women in and out of the palace. Ministers who preached austerity extorted merchants building mansions with money stolen from famine relief funds. The dynasty's elites turned corruption into an art form, all while punishing the poor for crimes of survival. A farmer who stole grain to feed his children could be flogged or executed, while an official who siphoned thousands of bushels for personal profit was quietly promoted. The double standard was staggering. Laws against gambling and drunkenness were enforced brutally on commoners. Yet the Forbidden City was infamous for its hidden chambers of excess, where courtiers bet fortunes on games and drowned themselves in wine. Publicly, the empire claimed to be a realm of discipline. Privately, it looked more like a debauched reality show, complete with bribes, scandals, and jealous rivalries. This hypocrisy wasn't harmless. It hollowed the empire from within. Famine struck repeatedly during the Ming era, and while peasants starved in the countryside, palace kitchens overflowed with delicacies. Grain shipments meant to feed provinces were diverted into the capital to keep the emperor's tables stocked. Hungry villagers watched their children die while officials congratulated themselves on preserving cosmic harmony. It was the kind of cruelty that disguises itself in moral language, the worst kind of cruelty. And the sermons never stopped. Imperial edicts demanded obedience and chastity. Women outside the palace were told their only virtue was loyalty to their husbands, even if it meant committing suicide after his death. Widows who remarried were shamed, while palace concubines were forced into jealous cages of exploitation. Harmony was preached, but pain was the reality. What made it even more grotesque was how often decadence was justified with superstition. Emperors consulted alchemists who promised immortality through bizarre elixirs, some laced with mercury or arsenic. While their subjects were jailed for minor crimes, the rulers slowly poisoned themselves in their quest to cheat death. These were men who proclaimed divine authority, yet feared mortality so deeply they swallowed poison in the hope of eternity. It was hypocrisy on every level. The dynasty claimed to be the most virtuous in the world, but its guardians of morality were corrupt, its emperors decadent, its officials greedy, and its religious pretenses absurd. Virtue was nothing more than propaganda, another mask painted onto a crumbling face. And yet, the mask worked, at least for a time. Foreign visitors continued to write about the discipline and order of Ming society. Dazzled by its rituals and laws, they saw harmony, not hunger, order, not oppression. The empire was a master illusionist, hiding its rot behind a stage curtain of ceremonies. But illusions cannot feed the starving, and hypocrisy cannot hold an empire together forever. Because when famine deepened and rebellions spread, all the porcelain, palaces, and moral sermons in the world could not stop the collapse. And when collapse came, it was not slow, not graceful, not noble. It was chaos, betrayal, and blood. The dynasty that built walls to keep fear out was about to discover that its greatest enemy was already inside. Every empire tells itself the same lie, that its walls will last forever. The Ming Dynasty built the greatest of them all. Stone stretched across mountains, fortresses rising like scars on the earth. It was supposed to be unbreakable, but no wall, however high, can keep out hunger. No gate, however heavy, can shut out despair. By the 17th century, the cracks that had been hidden behind porcelain and ritual split wide open. Famines swept across the countryside, crops withered under drought, rivers flooded with rage, locusts devoured what little remained. Entire villages starved to death. Parents abandoned children on the roadside. Desperate peasants ate bark, leather, even dirt to survive. Yet the imperial court continued to demand taxes, squeezing the starving for grain that no longer existed. What wasn't stolen by officials rotted in storage or was redirected to feed the emperor's endless banquets. The mask of harmony was rotting, and the stench was everywhere. Out of this misery rose rebellion. Bandits became heroes, farmers became warlords, entire provinces turned against their supposed guardians. One of the most infamous, Li Zikeng, began as a postal worker who had seen starvation firsthand. His armies, ragged and furious, marched across the land, fueled not by wealth but by rage. They called him the dashing king, and for the starving, he was a savior. For the Ming, he was a nightmare. Inside the Forbidden City, the dynasty's leaders were paralyzed. Eunuchs still schemed, officials still argued over ritual, and emperors still hid behind ceremony while the empire crumbled outside. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, embodies the tragedy perfectly. He inherited chaos. But instead of rallying his people, he drowned in paranoia, executing loyal officials he suspected of betrayal, while leaving real corruption untouched. His reign became a spiral of fear, a slow-motion collapse where every decision pushed the dynasty closer to death. By 1644, rebellion reached the gates of Beijing. The great capital, built as the jewel of the empire, now shook with the thunder of revolt. Li Zicheng's forces stormed the city, and panic consumed the Forbidden City itself. Servants fled, concubines screamed, eunuchs vanished into shadows. The Son of Heaven, once considered divine, was reduced to a hunted man in his own palace. Chongzhen fled into the hills behind the Forbidden City. There, beneath a lonely tree, he made his final gesture. Wrapping a rope around his neck, the emperor who ruled the Middle Kingdom took his own life rather than face capture. When villagers found his body, they discovered not a god but a broken man in ragged robes, his dignity gone. The mandate of heaven, that mystical justification for Chinese rulers, had finally abandoned him. But the story doesn't end with rebellion. Fate twisted cruelly one last time. Li Zicheng's rebels seized Beijing, but they would not keep it. Only weeks later, another power arrived at the gates. The Manchus, a people the Ming had spent decades trying to wall out. They swept into the capital and claimed it for themselves, establishing the Qing dynasty. The Ming had died, not with a triumphant battle, but with betrayal, suicide, and the invasion of the very barbarians they had sworn to resist. The collapse of the Ming is almost Shakespearean in its irony. The dynasty that obsessed over control lost everything to chaos. The empire that built walls to keep enemies out fell to the outsiders they feared most. The rulers who demanded loyalty reaped rebellion instead. What porcelain and palaces had hidden for centuries, fear, hunger, corruption, finally tore through the mask. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the Ming did not collapse only because of enemies at its gates. It collapsed because of enemies within its walls. The paranoia, the hypocrisy, the cruelty, it all hollowed the empire until nothing remained but a shell. And when the winds of famine and rebellion blew, that shell cracked instantly. The Golden Empire had turned to dust. And yet its story doesn't end with collapse. Because even after its ruins were swallowed by the king, the Ming left behind something that still haunts us today. Its obsession with appearances, with fear, with control at all costs. Those ghosts didn't vanish. They linger, echoing in ways that reach disturbingly close to our own age. The Ming Dynasty is long dead. Its palaces stand as tourist attractions. Its porcelain rests safely behind glass in museums. Its walls snake across mountains like scars fading into the horizon. But the ghosts of the Ming have never truly vanished. They linger in the stories of cruelty, in the whispers of paranoia, and in the hypocrisy that still feels disturbingly familiar. Remember the levels of descent. It began with beauty, a mask of porcelain and palaces, a promise of golden harmony. Then came the shadows, mutilated eunuchs, who, stripped of family and manhood, became puppet masters of emperors. Behind them were the concubines, locked away in a paradise that was nothing more than a prison of jealousy and despair. Beyond the palace walls, punishment turned into theater, torture into entertainment. Surveillance spread like smoke until trust itself was suffocated. And while the rulers preached virtue, they drowned in their own corruption, their hypocrisy so glaring that even famine could not cover it. In the end, all that remained was chaos. An emperor hanging from a tree, rebels looting the capital, and outsiders walking through the gates they had been walled out of for centuries. The lesson is clear. Fear can build greatness, but it cannot sustain it. Walls, spies, and torture may control people for a time, but they hollow out the very foundation they claim to protect. The Ming collapsed, not just because of enemies at its borders, but because it destroyed itself from within, corroded by paranoia, cruelty, and lies. And yet, perhaps the most chilling truth is how modern it feels. We no longer gather in squares to watch men flayed alive, but we do feast on humiliation, cheering as strangers are ruined online. We no longer send eunuchs to whisper in our leaders' ears, but we still live in worlds where proximity to power matters more than honesty. We no longer build palaces filled with concubines, but we still treat women as objects of status, locked in invisible cages of expectation. Surveillance may no longer come from the Eastern Depot, but it hums quietly in the glow of our screens, watching, recording, reminding us that nothing is ever truly private. The Ming Dynasty is gone, but the machinery of fear and spectacle it perfected survives in new skins. Every time we see leaders hide behind rituals while indulging in excess, every time cruelty is disguised as morality, every time surveillance makes us second-guess our words, we are glimpsing those ghosts. The porcelain still shines, the walls still stand, but if you listen closely, beneath the polished surfaces, you can still hear the echoes of suffering. And those echoes ask us a question. If even the greatest golden empire could crumble under the weight of its own hypocrisy, what makes us think we are any safer?